Tyler, right now, this summer feels different than last summer because hopefully pretty soon we're going to be able to put the pandemic behind us. But there are still so many questions, especially for employers. It's a crazy world right now.
Yeah, it's a sticky situation because we're returning to normal, but normal's still looking different because we're not entirely at that point where we can open the doors back up fully and regularly and say, okay, everybody's back to normal. We're still not at that 70% threshold. So kind of having that mixed bag situation can provide some hurdles to jump over.
To help us clear up some of the confusion, let's bring in Deborah Brouwer. She is the co-managing partner over at the Nemeth Law Firm, a labor and employment law firm. What a year it has been.
Well, that is certainly true. I mean, the old adage is we live in interesting times, and let's double down on that. The last year and a half have been very interesting, and it doesn't seem to be slowing down. Lots of changes and new issues on the horizon, sort of on a daily basis.
And with that, Deborah, I really wonder how so many businesses are going to handle it, because now as more employees start to go back into the office, there's going to be discussion about who can be remote, who's not remote, vaccinated employees versus non-vaccinated employees. And when we look to the governor for guidance, some of these rules and regulations, they're kind of hard to follow.
Well, that's true also, because we're getting the rules and the guidance from a lot of different sources. We're getting them from the CDC, the federal government, that's guidance. We're getting rules from MIOSHA, that's the state organization that is responsible for workplace safety. And then the federal agency, OSHA, for the same process, all are coming up with different things. So it does make it challenging for employers, but there are some pretty basic things that employers can take away right now. You can mandate people be vaccinated. You can still mandate that people wear masks. And people you can allow people to work remotely, but you can also tell people that they have to come back to work. So those are sort of the big parameters of the situation that employers are facing right now.
If we can talk about vaccination right now, what happens if an employer requires employees to get vaccinated and then someone has severe side effects from that vaccination? Would that employer be responsible, or typically there's some type of waiver you have to sign?
Well, I don't think the employer would be legally responsible. The employer didn't sort of cause directly those side effects, but I certainly would suggest to employers, to my clients, that they provide the paid time off through their own policies, or perhaps making an exception to an employee who has side effects from the vaccine. I mean, that whole area, the personal injury aspect of vaccine side effects, I think that is yet to play out. There are immunities involved that the government has provided to both employers and I think to the companies that manufacture. But from an employer perspective, what the employer can immediately do is make sure that that employee gets health care and gets the time off needed to respond to any type of side effect, even if it's just a day of headaches.
Do you anticipate this is going to end up in the courts?
Almost everything ends up in the courts.
That is true.
So yes, to some extent. And let me give you an example of how things end up in the courts. There's a hospital in Houston that was mandating that its employees be vaccinated. And the reason was for the health of the patients, coworkers, everybody. And those employees sued and said that they were being forced to be guinea pigs in government mandated testing of a vaccine. They compared it to the medical experiments conducted during the Nazi regime. And they lost immediately.
But I'm like, who was their attorney that put that in their argument?
Well, an attorney who's looking for a lot of publicity, probably. The judge did not take to it kindly. And I think that type of, so it's litigated, but it lost, and it lost as it should be. Public policy supports vaccinations. It doesn't support people being unvaccinated.
What's so confusing throughout this time as well, what is the difference in what's protected under HIPAA and what is not?
Right. A lot of people are saying that, sharing information regarding vaccine, if my employer does that, that's a HIPAA violation. Well, it may be a violation, but not of HIPAA, unless the employer is a medical facility. HIPAA only applies to very specific medical facilities. But employers should not be sharing medical information regarding their employees. That may be covered under other laws, the Americans with Disabilities Act, also common sense. Medical information is private, so you shouldn't be talking about the medical status of your employees. So how that plays out is you can ask an employee if they've been vaccinated, but you really can't get any more medical details. You can't ask why they were not, because that may lead to, I have some disability that precludes me from being vaccinated, and the employer doesn't need to know that and shouldn't know that. And to the extent the employer does get documentation of who's been vaccinated, for purposes of taking off your mask, that information should be kept privately and only on a need-to-know basis.
We're talking with Deborah Brouwer here on the MegaCast. She's the co-managing partner for the Nemeth Law Firm. And Deborah, because when we're looking at that as well, if an employer is going to allow vaccinated people to work without a mask, but unvaccinated people will still have to wear a mask, how is that going to look and work in an office setting?
It, to me, could look pretty bad. It's one of my concerns, and I don't think there's an easy solution. If you have a group of, or even one, unvaccinated person who still must wear a mask, that person still must socially distance, you're sort of creating two groups of workers, and physically separated on top of it.
Yeah.
And I think that has the potential for causing problems in the workplace, sort of an us versus them type of approach. And it can go about both ways. People who are vaccinated can be critical of people who are not, and the non-vaccinated, if it's for whatever reason, because of principle, because the person is pregnant and can't get vaccinated, they can feel resentful and critical of the people who are vaccinated. So it is a potential problem. And my advice to employers is to just, enforce your non-bullying policies and try to, get people talking about the work of the employer as opposed to unrelated issues, and to try to minimize, smooth over those differences. And another solution, I have a client who yesterday told me that they only have 30% of their workforce vaccinated. So everyone still is wearing a mask. They have not removed the mask requirement. And so that is, at least for the moment, a solution. Hopefully this will play out and there will be higher level of vaccination and this issue will move on.
And it seems like that's probably really the best way to go about it, because employers, it can be so sticky for them, and you never know who's going to sue and who's not going to sue. We saw the issue even in the beginning with asking people if they'd been tested for COVID.
Right.
And if someone says I was exposed, so I'm out for 10 days, and that conversation was hard for employees and employers.
Right, it definitely was. And it helped a little bit because people were working remotely, but as employers are bringing people back to work, now we're sort of faced with dealing with those issues right there in the workplace. And I think these are short-lived problems in the big picture, and people will sort of adjust. But for the moment, it can be a very sticky issue. And the most important thing, employers just need to be sensitive to it. They need to realize it can be a problem. They need to be alert and sensitive to it and manage the problem. It's all about workplace culture, that it's a good place to work, that it's a safe place to work. That message needs to get out to your employees.
So how hard is it, though, with we read some of these executive orders that come down, or the orders from OSHA and MyOSHA. They're confusing. They're very gray.
Yes, yes. Oh, and words are not defined. And that's deliberate with a lot of legislation and a lot of orders. First of all, they're usually a compromise. So you're dealing with a lot of different viewpoints, and you try to pick neutral language that satisfies everybody. And also, I think the drafters are building in some wiggle room. They don't want to be pinned down. So you may think they're confusing. I do too. They're very hard to read, and they refer to previous orders. You have to go back and look at the previous order. So, my simple advice is call your attorney. But
and let you deal with the fine print.
Right. There is a lot of advice and explanation online. A lot of these governmental agencies have websites with FAQs, and sometimes those FAQs translate the language of those orders into something a little bit more digestible and a little bit easier to understand.
So what you were saying, though, an employer can require you to get vaccinated.
Yes, yes. The EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which sort of oversees disability laws, has said that employers can require vaccinations. You have to have exceptions for people who have a disability and therefore cannot. And you have to also accommodate people's religious objections to being vaccinated. So you can mandate that. I don't think a lot of employers are. It seems to be increasing a little bit. The problem for an employer is you got to be ready to fire people if they don't get vaccinated. If that's your policy, you got to be ready to enforce it. And you have to then be prepared to have a hard time finding replacement workers. Because as your previous guest mentioned, it is difficult for employers to be filling those slots these days.
Deborah Brouwer with us here on the MegaCast. She's the co-managing partner for the Nemeth Law Firm, a labor employment law firm. And so as we're starting to go back, and so many people have gotten used to being remote, and their boss wants them to come back full time, they pretty much have to do it, right? Or find another job.
Right. I mean, it's sort of the same response to the mandate vaccination issue. So what employers should do and what an employee could ask also, I think, is to sort of do it gradually. Give people, either bring them in the office on site part-time, let them continue to work remotely part-time. Give people a lot of warning. We're going to do this September 1st. So they have an opportunity to adjust, sort of their schedules. Get the dog walker back so you have someone to help with the pets. Get child care issues, resolve those types of issues. But also to get adjusted sort of mentally. People got really used to working remotely. And I think that's one of the hiring problems too, is because there are people who decided that they just don't want to work on site anymore. And if they're required to do so, they're not going to. They're going to find a different job where they can continue to work remotely because it suits their life better.
Just a few more minutes with you here on the show. If remote firing, is that happening right now?
I think so. I don't think it's happening a lot.
If I had to fire someone, I'd rather do it over Zoom.
It's easier.
Sure.
It's easier.
Sure, I can imagine. It's something that I think we'll see more of a little bit. I mean, as we'll see more, a lot of stuff is going to stay remote, even when people are back on site. And this might be one of those things. Though I do think firing is a very personal issue for the person being fired, certainly, and have it done by camera rather than in person seems a little cold. But it does eliminate some of the issues regarding having to walk the person out of the office. It's less emotional in that way. But firing is firing, and it's never pleasant for anybody. And we'll still be seeing some of that, particularly if people aren't getting vaccinated despite a mandate, or they aren't returning to work despite the mandate to come back to the office.
So with that, Deborah, any last words of advice that you want to give to all of us regular employees, but also to the employers?
Well, everyone just has to remain flexible. Everything is changing so quickly, and something that was an issue 3 months ago is not an issue now, but there's a new issue. So be flexible and talk to each other. I mean, if an employee does not want to come back to work in the office now, but can do it in 6 weeks, how about that employee offering that to the employer? So people should talk. They should talk and be flexible and not take those hardened positions that then results in firings, whether remote or otherwise.
I'm sure your phone has been ringing a lot over this past year because it's been an unusual year,
To say the least.
Deborah Brouwer with us here on the MegaCast, co-managing partner for the Nemeth Law Firm. Great to have you with us. Thank you again for your expertise.
Oh, I was very glad to share it, and it was fun talking to you.